And so we're not called to be stoics. We're called to be passionate in the way that we live. And you see that with the saints.
Yeah.
These are people who are fully alive.
In the Christian imagination, the ultimate act is to lay down your life in martyrdom. Should we seek martyrdom? Should we want to be martyrs?
I didn't want to be rejected. And it was in doing that I realized the efforts that I went to in order not to have a stranger say no to me made me realize that I needed to grow in boldness. And I'd encourage people to try this, and it might just change your life.
Hello, I'm Father John.
Hello, I'm Fr Toby.
And welcome to Good Habits, our podcast exploring questions and meaning through the tradition of the virtues. And today we're turning to courage, facing our fears. How do we grow in courage? What is this virtue? Some might say the word on the street is that the most courageous act is for a Dominican to eat bolognese. Is this a good understanding of courage?
It might be, or you could even say the most courageous act is to go out looking like that.
Yeah, indeed. The dangers of eating in a white habit.
Yeah.
This. Yeah.
My mother sometimes says to me that you can tell our order was founded by a man because women have been much more practical and would have dressed in white.
Perhaps, yeah.
I think eating bolognese, yeah, maybe that's courageous, and it gets at something that there's something that we're going to lose with courage, something that we're scared. There's something that we're afraid of.
Yeah. So it's about facing our fears in some way.
Yeah, there's a real element of that, but it's not just that, because I remember a story was told when I was at school about a boy who was sitting an entrance exam for Cambridge, and the question on the paper was, what is courage? And according to the mythical story, the boy writes a couple of words, puts down his pen, and just calmly walks out of the examination hall. And then when they look at what he wrote afterwards to the question, what is courage? He'd written, this is. And we all think, yeah, that's awesome. Like, I want to be like that. You know, I hope I get set that question one day. But the reality is that's not actually courageous. It is doing something that most people would be scared to do, but it lacks reason. We might say that was reckless rather than courageous. So it gets at the idea that courage involves something about overcoming fear, but not doing something simply because other people would be scared to do it makes you courageous.
And fortitude is another word used for this virtue. Is that picking up on something slightly different? Is that a better word, or do we prefer courage?
Yeah, I think fortitude is a better translation. Like the Latin speaks about fortitudo, and that gets at this element that what the virtue that Aquinas is talking about, and obviously we're referencing Aquinas quite a lot in this series, sometimes explicitly, but he's always there in the background, which tends to be a case in any Dominican conversation. You'll never avoid him, but he sees two elements that constitute the virtue of courage. So there's the one that we might more obviously think of as courageous, where you go and you do something that's really scary. You know, in the war movie, the soldier going over the top out of the trenches. But he also sees this other element to fortitude, which is enduring in something difficult. And I think there we don't think of courage so much, and so I think fortitude is a helpful word to use, and embraces both this sort of attack mode and this endurance mode. And
fortitude having something in common with the Latin word for strength, and the idea you need strength for both the attack and the endurance side of things that courage doesn't pick up on. Yeah, I suppose one thing courage does pick up on, which is also important, is the English word comes from the French, which talks about the heart, the cœur, and there's something about courage that does speak to our heart and coming from our heart and our emotions. And on that, we've been speaking about virtues as perfecting our powers. Virtues are these stable dispositions we have that perfect the capacities that human beings had. And we've looked at what's distinctive to being human in terms of our powers, particularly intellect and will, our reason and our attraction to the good. Where are we locating this virtue of fortitude? Yeah,
so we saw prudence predominantly with the intellect about right decision making, and then justice with the will. Fortitude comes in with what we call the passions, and though not directly the same, largely if we use emotions, that helps us understand a lot of what Aquinas is talking about when he talks about passions. There's something of this passive element to it. The passions happen to us. We don't choose for them to happen. We just happen to feel this way. And so when we were speaking about the human person, we'd spoken about what we share in common with the animals and with vegetative life. Ask ourselves sometimes, which level of life am I living at? The vegetative, the animal, or the fully human? And it's a good question to ask. But animals have passions. Animals have emotions too. And the most fundamental passion for Aquinas is love. And I don't know, you've been in that situation where you've said when you were younger, like, I love pizza, and your mother corrects you and says,
I don't love pizza, I like pizza.
Yeah. Well, Aquinas says your mum is wrong.
Outrageous.
Yeah, I know. She's a lovely lady and she's right on most things. But is that love is the principal dynamic in the passion. So simply we see something and we perceive it as good. And because that's the way we've been made, we've been created and made to love that which is good.
And are these emotions, would we say they're fundamentally good things? Is it good to be a passionate human being? Or should we be quite cautious about our emotions? Should we be quite stoical? Emotions, we've got to suppress those.
Yeah, like it's sometimes said, an Englishman shows his emotions by a quiver of his upper lip, and kind of lean into that stereotype and think it's good. It's not great.
Yeah.
Like emotions for Aquinas, like they're really, really important. They're the basic dynamism of our everyday life. And if you think in most of life, if you had to sort of think every single thing through in every single detail, like you'd never do anything. You need this basic dynamism.
Yeah.
And so we're not called to be stoics. We're called to be passionate in the way that we live. And you see that with the saints.
Yeah.
Like these are people who are fully alive, on fire with God. And Jesus doesn't want us lukewarm. He wants us on fire. The problem is that, and where sort of stoicism becomes attractive, is that sometimes we can see what a person's life looks like when they're controlled by their passions.
You mentioned earlier it's good to ask oneself the question, what level of life am I living at? Am I vegetative? Am I sensitive? Am I rational? And someone might think, well, clearly I need to be thinking the whole time I want to live at the top level. But really what I'm saying, you want to be living all three all the time. You want to be passionate.
Yeah.
Obviously you want to be eating and growing and vegetative, but you want your passions to be ordered by reason and your highest powers. To be fully alive, fully human is to exercise all one's capacities and powers all the time.
Yeah. And I think you can see sort of the case of the person who hasn't let reason enter into the passions properly, and maybe we'll talk about it in a bit more detail when we speak about temperance. But in the person who's a drug addict or some form of other addiction, and they're being completely controlled by a passion, but when we look at it, we realize this is a sad way to be living your life. They're being dominated in their living by an appetite, and they might be using their reason to help them get the thing. So it doesn't mean that they're not using their reason, but actually their reason hasn't properly ordered the passion. And so we need our passions to, as Aquinas puts it, to participate in reason. Which doesn't mean saying I must not feel this way. It's not emotional suppression or repression, but rather allowing our reason to inform the desiring and the aversion of our passions.
And they're really important because we could talk about fear also, as fear keeps you alive. I remember a brother of ours in Cambridge, who I'm talking about, who's quite prone to accidents and has a lot of very amusing stories of his life. But one thing he says is whenever he cycles around London, he says, remember to be afraid, it will keep you alive. And it's true. If we're not afraid of things, No,
like fear is really primal and really, really useful. And I've seen sometimes like parents worry about their toddlers. They're like, this one, he just doesn't appear to be afraid of anything. I have to watch him every single moment. Like he's got no survival instinct whatsoever. The person who plays Russian roulette, and experiences no fear, like that's a stupid person. That's not a rational person.
Which brings us back to that line you mentioned, I think, in the context of prudence, no stupid person can be good. Putting it provocatively, but we need the exercise of reason for the good life, for the moral life. So the passions, which is as good when well ordered. Where does fortitude come in particularly?
Yeah, well, fortitude comes into what we call these irascible passions.
So there's some obstacle.
Yeah, and so the example of trying to go after the good thing, but it's difficult, and so where I might have a tendency towards despair, fortitude keeps me going. In the same way, sometimes the appropriate response might actually be to run away. That might be the better thing to do. It's not courageous to go over the top in war when there's 50 soldiers on the opposite side, all with machine guns, and you've got a knife. That Aquinas wouldn't consider an exercise of courage.
Yeah.
That's just stupidity.
Yeah.
Lie low, fight another day when you've got a better chance.
Yeah. So, and would you say that applies? You mentioned earlier this attack and endurance element of courage. Is the reason involved in the same way in both? Discerning between them? Yes.
Sometimes you have to decide when to attack, and sometimes you've got to decide when to endure. But actually, Aquinas sees endurance as the principal element of the virtue, and the same. I think we can see how it's also more necessary in our lives, because for some of us in our life, the opportunity to do this thing which the press would celebrate as really heroic, that might not arise. But in everyday life, we have to endure difficult things for the sake of holding on to something better. I think you sometimes hear people say that you can, sacrifice in daily life on the altar. You can sacrifice your greatest desires, or you can have a life with no sacrifice, where you never actually get what your greatest desire is.
And Aquinas puts martyrdom as the ultimate act of courage, right? Because that's the ultimate form of endurance. I think that, of course, these virtues we've been speaking about have a long history, pre-Christian history, and for the Romans, the ultimate act of fortitude was to lay down your life for your country, for your homeland. And in the Christian imagination, the ultimate act is to lay down your life for martyrdom. Should we seek martyrdom? Should we want to be martyrs?
No, you don't have. Some saints have wanted it, and I read St. Ignatius of Antioch and him desiring martyrdom, and I think I don't really want that. You don't have to, but many great saints have.
Yeah.
I think an example of somebody who really didn't want it but recognized that at a certain point this was going to become necessary is St. Thomas More. Where he wasn't looking for an opportunity to sort of embarrass the king, but eventually when the king said, well, what are you going to put first? The Church of Jesus Christ or your loyalty to me? That he realizes at a certain point, actually, now I have to make a decision.
And he writes very clearly and beautifully from prison to his daughter Meg, including lines where he speaks about his fear of the pain of his execution. He's very honest about that, and I think that shows why there's a real virtue being exercised there. It's not that he's got no fear of execution by any means. He's enduring through that for what he believes is the highest good. Yeah,
and that endurance is going on at like every moment of his life in imprisonment.
Yes.
Whereas that courageous act might be a one-off act. This endurance of holding fast, holding on to God, the greatest good, holding on to the truth about God, at the cost of, first of all, of imprisonment, discomfort, and then to the ultimate act of fortitude, as Aquinas sees it, to be prepared to die as a witness to the faith.
Which is a nice reminder of something we've been talking about a lot, to make clear that a virtue is not the act. The virtue is the stable disposition, and what Thomas More showed there is the disposition, the skill he had to persevere, which of course is manifest in his actions, in his decisions to persevere in that moment. But it's because he had the virtue, which was this skill, the stable disposition to good action in him that enabled that. I was finding just interesting on martyrdom, because St. Ignatius of Antioch, you mentioned, does speak quite explicitly about his desire to be in the Roman circus. And
don't try and rescue me.
Yeah, no, indeed. He puts the Romans off, saying, don't try and rescue me, and speaks very beautifully about the kind of Eucharistic nature of his sacrifice being crushed and eaten in the circus. But the early church also quite explicitly forbade voluntary martyrdom. They said, don't. So what he's doing is something slightly different to someone who would basically go and kind of turn up, knock on the emperor's door and say, I hate your gods, kill me. Because they're not really seeking God, the highest good. They're trusting in their own powers. And so something's different going on with courage. Voluntary martyrdom is different to seeking to lay down your life.
Yeah. And I remember actually saying on a retreat once when I was at Mount St. Bernard's to a Jesuit priest, how it seemed in some way, and it might be incredibly naive of me, but the easier way to become a saint, it seemed to me, was, just to be confronted with this one heroic decision, to be martyred and then to be done with. Actually much harder just to endure in the difficulties of Christian life day after day after day. And this is the example you were giving, where we see how the virtues interact with one another, and that it would be imprudent to go and knock on the door of somebody who you knew would kill you for declaring your Christian faith. But at the same time, we can see in other examples where people will think, I can preserve my life for the sake of denying my faith. And obviously the church says that you can't do that.
Yeah. There are... In St. Thomas's tradition, he talks about the virtues with different parts underneath them. Do you think you could say something about the different parts of fortitude as a way of expanding on the virtue?
Yeah, you've got sort of patience, you have perseverance, and then particularly important, I like to think about it, sort of magnanimity. Another one of those which I'm pleased I got that out pronounced the first time. Doesn't always happen. But magnanimity, magna anima, like great soul, desiring to do great things for God. And obviously we have the Magnificat, which we pray in evening prayer at Vespers each evening with Mary, and recognizing that the Lord is going to do great things through her. And I think that especially young Christian men and women right now really need to sort of appropriate this virtue, desire to grow in it, to do great things for the sake of the Lord, but recognizing that to do great things for the sake of God, that requires fortitude. It will be hard work. If you're going to be a Christian scholar, it's hard work to sit at your desk and to study when there might be other more entertaining things to do. If you're going to become a great sort of carpenter, or even a great athlete, there's endurance required for the sake of those things.
Courage is fortitude is such a rich virtue in the literary tradition, and I know you have a great interest in literature. Are there any particular characters that you think really exemplify this virtue and bring out its many different features?
I think it's very easy as a Catholic to always go to the Lord of the Rings.
Always a good place to go.
And I'm not really going to try and be original.
Yeah.
I think you can see it there in Frodo and perhaps especially in Samwise Gamgee, that these are not powerful, strong people capable of physically overcoming all the evils that they're gonna face. They're a great example of enduring in difficulty for the sake of good, for the sake of the mission that they've been entrusted with. They can't see how everything is going to pan out. It's definitely not going to pan out well in the next 5 minutes for them, and yet they endure in it. They never give way to despair, to just give up on the task with which they've been entrusted.
And do you think there's something in that and what they share that can kind of help us grow in courage? What would you say to someone who's looking to grow in courage, has a particular fear they're facing?
I think to be really intentional about it, and to recognize, to allow your reason to come into your fear. So in the thing that you're going after, and it could be something as simple as like, I really want a pay rise, but I'm too afraid to ask.
Yeah.
What is the fear? What might happen if you ask? Is it possible that your boss might sack you? In which case, maybe the fear is legitimate. Like, you wouldn't actually be allowed to. I used to work in law. I know you can't do that. Is it, I don't want to lose face if he says no? What is behind the fear, and is this a reasonable thing? Am I giving up something that I really, really want for the sake of a loss of something that's less good than the thing that I want? And I think when we bring our reason into our fear, we can start to see, is this fear rational? So the person who says, I'm too afraid to go cage diving with sharks, well, maybe actually that's just quite a sensible way to behave in the world, particularly because I saw a video the other day of a great white that managed to get inside the cave, and I've heard about the shark attacks in Sydney, and I'm not going in the water for a while, as much as I love surfing. But I think one of the most helpful things to recognize, our principal fear is fear of death. But I think we also experience this fear of social death. You hear it with actors or, people when they go, I could have died, or, I died on stage tonight. And one of my professors, when I was studying out in Rome, he said, bad news, brothers and sisters. In this class, we're going to undertake something called rejection therapy. The module was on fear, fortitude, and resilience. And he said, this is not something that you can learn about in the abstract. So sadly, you can't just listen to this podcast and go away and automatically be a person of fortitude. You will have to practice acts of fortitude in order to become fortitudinous.
Yeah.
Is that thing? I don't.
Put.
Yeah. Just the way the man on the street would put it as well. You have to act in a courageous way in order to become courageous. So he said, we're going to do rejection therapy. And then he played us some videos of this American guy called Zhang, who for 100 days in a row had deliberately asked for something which he thought he'd be rejected for. So you can tell it's American because I think on the first day he asked to borrow like $100, and on the next day I think he goes into Five Guys and he says, I know the way you do free drinks refills. I've always thought it would be really cool if you did free burger refills. Can I have one? And obviously they say no. And then he goes into Krispy Kreme and he asks, can you make me donuts in the shape of the Olympic rings? Really interesting what actually happens to him. But what you see is that he gets more emboldened.
Yeah.
And that so often we're held back from doing good things because of this fear of rejection. And we experience rejection as this rejection of the totality of my person, whereas more often they're just actually saying no to the particular thing that we asked for. But I think this is one very simple and concrete way, and quite good fun. Like, I'd advise you, if you're watching this, tell a friend about it, like, subscribe, whatever, and watch it with them. And then say, like, actually, should we engage in rejection therapy? And don't ask for bad things. That would be a lack of prudence to ask for immoral things. But intentionally with one another, be a little bit bolder. And what was instructive to me was the thing we were asked to do first of all was just to hand a miraculous medal to somebody on the street. And I then started to read up all about the history of the miraculous medal. And then I was standing by the Colosseum looking for somebody who looked really friendly. So therefore I picked an American rather than an English person. And I asked this American lady, would she like this medal? And, and then I had some accompanying information on it because I didn't want to look superstitious or I didn't want to be rejected. And it was in doing that I realized the efforts that I went to in order not to have a stranger say no to me made me realize that I needed to grow in boldness. And I'd encourage people to try this and it might just change your life.
Yeah. I think we're both familiar with the ministry Night Fever, which involved in Oxford, which is a beautiful example of going and approaching people on the street and inviting them in to pray before the Blessed Sacrament. And I remember first doing this as a student, and you are quite hesitant about going up to random people, and a lot of them do just say no. But I noticed over the course of the evening for myself, but also attending lots of these Night Fevers and seeing the volunteers just grow in confidence over the course of the evening, it was beautiful. And obviously there's something very beautiful there about bringing people to encounter Christ as form of evangelization. But often I think so many of the graces of Night Fever came out of the volunteers and how they've been enabled to be given that confidence to practice that virtue and grow in courage and speaking to strangers, being rejected, but then some of them say yes, and what came from that.
In that survey they did recently, the quiet revival on that sort of younger people coming back to church and people between 16 and 25 being far more likely to attend church than their parents. One of the things that people said was, and I think it's 2/3 of people said that if a friend invited them, they would go to church.
They would go to church, yes.
That shows the power of friendship, and actually just being a little bit bold. And if we're not careful, fear can start to make our lives very, very small. One of the things that I worried about with sort of COVID was that long after it ceased to be a sort of a pandemic, people just constantly used the language of like, be safe, as if safety was the highest human good.
Yeah. And I think part of growing in that, there's a lovely, the Serenity Prayer, which I think touches on a lot of things we've been talking about to do with courage. Lord, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And we could talk about prudence there, to know the difference. But you have both there, the serenity to endure through the things you can't change, and the courage to change the things you can. And I think that as a nice point to finish on, the spiritual life is, of course, fundamental here, to praying for that grace, that wisdom to discern the right path and to act boldly, live confidently.
Yeah, it's a great prayer. You don't need to be an alcoholic to pray it. Everybody should pray that prayer. There's so much in it. And that's probably a good point to finish on.
That is a good point to finish on before we move on to temperance next, to look at the virtue of temperance.
Yeah, which actually relates as well to, inordinate desire for alcohol and such things. So it's nice how that's worked out as a segue. Exactly. It's almost like it was planned.
Yeah, indeed. Very good. Thanks, Toby.
Thank you.
Good Habits is a CTS production in collaboration with the Dominican Friars in Britain
and Radio Maria England. And if you've liked this episode, which I sincerely hope you have, then please do like and subscribe.